It's Get Out of Here. I'm Warren Levinson. The travel guide Lonely Planet named Sri Lanka its destination of the year for 2019, and it's not hard to see why. The island nation south of India, it used to be called Ceylon, has some of the world's best beaches. It's known as a surfer's paradise. It has stunning train rides, spectacular flora, great wildlife, more Asian elephants close up than anywhere else, impressive religious architecture, vibrant cities and towns, and a wonderful cuisine. A major factor in the Lonely Planet designation was that a decade after emerging from a 26-year-long civil war, Sri Lanka's visitor infrastructure has developed to the point where it can readily accommodate all kinds of travelers. From the five-star golf and tennis resort seekers to the history and architecture buffs to the foodies and the backcountry hikers. For our tour, we have Emily Schmall, correspondent in the AP Bureau in New Delhi. We started with the shadow that hangs over the country from the terrorist attacks on 3 churches and 3 hotels in the commercial capital of Colombo last Easter. Emily Schmall, let's start with what we started 2019 with, which was Lonely Planet said, here's our country of the year. This is where you should go in 2019. It's Sri Lanka. Can we say with any confidence how that's affected the country?
How the Lonely Planet designation has affected the country?
Yeah.
I think it probably affected it quite positively. I think there was a lot of buzz when this Lonely Planet review came out and this recommendation came out. I know I was hearing from a lot of friends who were eager to visit my patch in South Asia because they'd seen this and, they'd heard good things about Sri Lanka, but this really sort of solidified it for them. There are these gorgeous pictures that Lonely Planet published of this famous train from an old British hill station called Ella going through all this beautiful jungle landscape. So it's a very compelling photo, and it's a compelling place. I think it did help, but pretty soon after the Lonely Planet recommendation came out, there was what was known in Sri Lanka as a constitutional coup, whereby the now former president, who just left office recently, decided to oust the sitting prime minister, who refused to leave the official residence of the prime minister. That didn't bother the president. He went ahead and appointed a new prime minister. So for a while, there were 2 prime ministers and not a lot getting done. And so a lot of those same friends who had reached out excited to meet me in Sri Lanka then started to express some consternation about timing.
I mean, just the stability of the government plays obviously a big role in whether somebody wants to go visit a country they may not know very much about.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think to a lot of people, Sri Lanka, the associations that one has with Sri Lanka are of the long civil war. They were at civil war for 26 years with a rebel group called the Tamil Tigers. And so I think a lot of people associate Sri Lanka with that period, which only ended in 2009. So I think when there was this political unrest, people were sort of concerned about how it would affect a fragile democracy. So I think that even though Sri Lanka had managed in a period of really just 5 short years to build what is really an impressive tourism sector that takes advantage a lot of their natural resources and their existing infrastructure, as well as a lot of new infrastructure. But certainly I think people were concerned when they heard that there were 2 prime ministers and there was a lot of heat at the top of government in Sri Lanka.
But we're down to 1 prime minister now, right?
Now we're down to 1, the former president, actually. Turns out it's actually the same person who was appointed prime minister last year. The Supreme Court last year said that the president didn't have the right to just appoint him like that and get rid of the other one. But this guy's now come back as the legitimate prime minister.
A more stable government. If we're talking about, obviously, safety, we cannot ignore anti-Muslim riots 2 years in a row, and we certainly can't ignore the Easter Sunday attacks this year. So how does that fit in the general scheme of things for somebody who wants to visit Sri Lanka?
Yeah, absolutely. I went to Sri Lanka the day of the Easter attacks to cover that with my colleagues based in Colombo. And, it was really a rattling experience for tourists and for residents. And, especially so when it became known that the government had received some intelligence, but that, again, due to this squabbling at the highest levels of government, it hadn't been communicated efficiently or effectively. And that did, of course, not really inspire confidence in Sri Lanka's government or its security sector. That said, I was really impressed with the professionalism that I observed in the tourism sector when I was in Colombo covering that story, from professional drivers to hotel receptionists and concierges to maintenance people and cooks and waiters. It was really impressive to me that everyone maintained what I see as just a really incredible friendliness and openness and professionalism, efficiency. Sri Lanka is actually a wonderful place to be a tourist in the sense that, especially as an English language speaker, most people on the island speak English or endeavor to speak English, but a very good number speak English fluently. And they're very concerned and want to sort of maintain a good rapport with tourists and visitors. So they really go to pains to accommodate people and to just sort of go the extra mile. And that was maintained even in those very, very scary days right after the attacks. So yeah, as you mentioned, there is a more stable government now. This government is really law and order. They were definitely brought into power because of their reputation for handling the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka in 2009. The new president is the former Secretary of Defense, who's widely lauded by the majority ethnic Sinhala Buddhist population there for crushing the Tamil Tiger rebels in 2009 and ending this 26-year conflict. But as you pointed out, there have been anti-Muslim riots. There is a clear rise of Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka that mirrors in some ways what we've observed in Myanmar. And so there have been these troubling incidents of religious violence, religious tension. So far, they've been fairly isolated, but the government up to this point hasn't done a very good job of assuring either tourists or the Muslim business people whose shops have been looted and torched that they will be in a position to protect them.
So it's in certain areas still a matter of you are going to exercise more caution than you would if you were going, say, to just a resort in North America.
I suppose so, but really, aside from these Easter attacks, which were unprecedented in Sri Lanka, the Easter attacks actually were the first time in an island that has had its fair share of terrorism and suicide bombings, unfortunately. But these Easter attacks were the first time that foreigners had been targeted. And in the ensuing anti-Muslim violence that has happened in Sri Lanka has targeted Muslim villages outside of main cities where tourists would go. So it's very, very, very unlikely that any tourists would be injured or find themselves in the line of fire, as it were. But yeah, this is still a developing country, a fragile democracy where exercise should be cautioned. It's not the kind of place where you go and just want to kind of forget about all of your problems and not be bothered at all by what's happening on the outside world. The thing about Sri Lanka that makes it really interesting is that it has all of these resort-like amenities, and it is a paradise in terms of nature. I mean, the jungles and the mountains and the ancient cities on the tops of these rocky bluffs and fantastic beaches, all of this is there. but you're going into a country that isn't, just sort of, that has a lot of tumultuous political history where people are very engaged with the politics of the country. But at the same time, I think really endeavor to ensure that to the extent they can, tourists are sort of insulated from that.
Well, let's talk about where you do want to go, because there are plenty of really good reasons to go to Sri Lanka. So I don't know, let's start with the beaches. How do they compare? Who goes?
Right. So some of the southern beaches of Sri Lanka draw a lot of surfers. They're really well known for just offering really fantastic surf in the Indian Ocean. And then further up the coast toward Colombo, they're sort of more family friendly. There are these beautiful resorts. And sort of in the middle, you have Galle, which has this ancient fort. So it's really interesting. It's really fun and easy to walk around. And the fantastic thing is you can take trains the entire stretch of the coast. And one of the remarkable things about Sri Lankan trains is they all have these first class observation coaches at the front of the train that have all glass pane sort of front windows and these beautiful huge windows on the side. So you can be sitting in there and just sort of feel like really literally be immersed in this fantastic nature that you're experiencing.
And what is the scenery like? I mean, I do keep hearing about these scenic train rides in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, so it depends. You can go from the tea plantations in Ella, which are these high elevation, sort of mountainous pastoral scenes that wind down into Kandy, which is a really interesting destination because it has this temple called the Temple of the Sacred Tooth Relic. It contains a relic that's believed to be one of the Buddha's teeth, and it's the most important Buddhist site in Sri Lanka and a really gorgeous place to visit. And the city of Kandy is surrounded by very lush mountain jungle-scape and dotted with these pristine lakes. And then from there, the train continues on toward Colombo, and it's almost just complete jungle on either side. So it's very, very scenic, very beautiful. And then from Colombo, as I mentioned, you can take the train down the coast to the very southernmost tip of Sri Lanka, and you've got beach to your right on the entire way, and the coast is gorgeous. The Indian Ocean. I was really amazed when I first saw it. It seemed darker somehow than the Atlantic or the Pacific. But, it's just this spectacular coastline that runs the entire length and width of the country. And
what about wildlife? If you look up things about Sri Lanka, the elephants pop up pretty quickly. So what are the opportunities to see wildlife up close?
Actually, if I can share a personal anecdote.
Please do.
When my sister was visiting, sure. So my sister was visiting from Chicago, and she loves wildlife, but is very anti-zoo. And so, obviously in India, there are a lot of reserves and parks and fantastic places to see wildlife. But I chose to take her to Sri Lanka for a number of reasons. One of them being that, as I mentioned before, Sri Lanka is just so tourist friendly and so efficient and clean and easy and beautiful. The food is great. So I took her there. We hired a car from our hotel and drove about 3 hours to this place called Dambula, which is this gorgeous Buddhist cave temple with all these impressive wall paintings of the Buddha, and then on to this place called Sigiriya, which is an ancient city on top of this rock. There's just a bunch of rocks sort of emerging from the earth there, and it's this fantastic climb and fantastic view. And then we went to Habarana, which is just a village, but it's surrounded by 3 of the best places for viewing of Asian elephants anywhere in Asia. And depending on the time of year, guides will take you in jeep safaris to see one or the other of these parks. We ended up in a park where we saw approximately 300 to 400 elephants in very close proximity. It was really exciting. It was really beautiful. The landscape, again, was spectacular, and it was just a very gratifying trip, to say the least.
And how did your sister, the wildlife enthusiast, rate it?
She was beside herself. She really was. She was just tickled. I mean, to be able to spend a couple of hours so close to these animals and just watch them, we noticed that we remarked to one another that we had never seen elephants play, I guess, because in zoos, obviously they don't have a lot of space and they're not in a big group, but in the wild, with a bunch of them, and they're not so intimidated by people, when there are many more of them than there are of you. They were playful and they were loquacious, and just it was wonderful for us both to see them. It was a really incredible experience.
And is Sri Lanka expensive to visit, say, relative to other South Asian places?
No, I would actually say it's less expensive. If you compare it to the Maldives, for example, it's far less expensive. The cost of food is a bit higher than in, say, neighboring India. Of course, they import a lot more than India does, but the cuisine is really, I think, fairly priced for what it is, which is fantastic seafood, fresh fruit, these incredible juices, and of course, famous Ceylon tea. So I think it's actually less expensive than neighboring Maldives, but probably slightly more than India. It probably compares in price most to a place like Thailand, and it has similarities to Thailand in other ways too. I think both countries really have the tourism industry down, where you know that upon landing, you're just going to be taken care of. You're going to be with professionals who you can communicate with easily, who you don't feel you're being manipulated by. It's just a sort of simple, easy, and pleasant experience from start to finish.
So you've talked about how the tourist experience is. They've really got that down, and I'm sure that was a large part of the Lonely Planet designation, that the tourist infrastructure has been built up to this point. But what about for the tourist who doesn't want to feel like a tourist, who wants to sort of rough it, who wants to essentially feel like he or she is living like a native? What kind of experiences are available to them?
Yeah, well, for example, I mentioned Sigiriya, which is this mountaintop fort a lot of people climb. And when we went there recently, there were a lot of tourists, but it was a sort of pretty structured experience. But just across from there are several other rocks that more adventurous and more able climbers take on. And there are no queues, there are no guides. There are fewer facilities, but I think a more time and to be away from the tourist crowd, there are opportunities. Similarly, Sri Lanka has a very long coastline on both sides. Very few tourists visit the east or the north of the country, and in part that's because those two areas of the country were the most consumed and most affected by the 26-year civil war with the Tamil Tigers. But similarly, they've experienced a decade of peace, and there's been a lot of rebuilding and investment there as well. So I think for tourists who want to get off the beaten track, a northern city like Jaffna might be really interesting, or beaches on the East Coast, which have far less development, don't have the resort all-inclusive experience, but have beautiful sandy beaches and fantastic food and just regular people living there are available. And again, I think it's not only that the tourism infrastructure and professionalism is really remarkable in Sri Lanka. What I've always noticed traveling there is that anyone I've spoken to, anyone I've interacted with at any level, any class, whether I'm interviewing them for a story or I'm ordering something at their restaurant, people are just incredibly nice and warm. I think it was that thing that really struck me when I first went there, and that most affected me when I was there after the horrible Easter attacks. is that these are obviously a really resilient people who've gone through this time of grief and terror over the Civil War, and then had this attack just this past April. But they don't come across as people who are resentful, or, I mean, I'm sure, some of our listeners have, especially us Americans, have probably experienced a few places in the world where being American is not always a great asset as a tourist. I think we joke, that sometimes if we can, we pretend we pose as Canadians, just because we think that, people will treat us better. And I think Sri Lanka is not one of those places. I feel really welcome. And I think people are just genuinely very warm and very, very interested in having foreigners visit.
That's great, Emily. Thank you so much. What are you dying to tell me that I've left out here?
It's a really fantastic cuisine. I think Anthony Bourdain sort of put it on the map a few years ago, but from what I can tell, it's a bit still undiscovered. Sri Lankan cuisine is not something you can find on the streets of New York or London, for example, but it's really, really quite good and quite varied. And so I would say that anybody visiting Sri Lanka should plan to spend some time eating, because it's one of the best experiences you can have there.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Emily Schmall is an Associated Press correspondent in New Delhi. After the break, what your fellow airline passengers are thinking. It's the AP Travel Podcast, Get Out of Here. I'm Warren Levinson. This is the spot where we usually do my favorite trip, but we've got something a little different this week. The market research and data company YouGov did a survey recently of what kinds of behavior air travelers find acceptable or unacceptable on a plane. For instance, conversation with your seatmate, 2/3 of respondents said, a little small talk only, please. 15% don't want to talk to you at all if they don't know you. 5% said they'd like a lot of conversation. YouGov data journalist Lindley Sanders wrote about the results of the survey, and she joins us now to say more. I mean, let's start with the most frequent issue that you get when you're on an airplane, which is, should you recline the seat back? I was surprised at the number of people who said, yeah, that's great, because I never do it. I feel like I don't want somebody reclining into me, and so I won't do it even if somebody reclines into me. I don't want to cut off their space behind me.
I think it's like a pretty common misconception that it's unacceptable to do this on an airplane. But what YouGov found in the data was that 70% of Americans say that it's completely or somewhat acceptable to go ahead and recline your seat. And there were no major differences based on the generations for this one either.
Right. It doesn't matter if you're old or young. Yeah, sure. Why not? It seems, okay, just get your arms race going on that plane. If somebody reclines into you, you push back into them, and et cetera. Okay. Should be all right.
We looked at people's height, too, to see if people of different height statures would have a different opinion on this. And across the board, people seem to find it pretty acceptable.
The shade on the window, whose property is that? Does that belong to the person in the window seat?
So what YouGov asked for this one was, should the person sitting nearest the window get sole or exclusive power over that window shade? And a plurality of Americans said that they should not. So I suppose the consensus here is that you should ask your neighbor whether or not they want the window shade up or down.
Because I make all this personal. I like the window seat. I like seeing the world from a different perspective. I want that window shade up so I can look out. And then once we're in a place where you can't see anything, I don't care. It does seem to me there's more of an emphasis on we want the cabin dark. Maybe it's because more people are looking at screens, either the screens that the airlines give us or the screens we bring on board. I don't know.
Right, could be.
Emotional support animals. This is kind of a fun category. So we've seen news stories over the last few years of some fairly exotic emotional support animals, and you got some reactions to them. 66% of your respondents said a snake is not an appropriate emotional support animal. And that was not a surprising number to me, except that who are the 34% who don't think it's not?
Well, interestingly enough, so 66% of U.S. adults overall say it's completely unacceptable to bring a snake as an emotional support animal. And there are really strong majorities among Gen X and baby boomers. 74% of Gen X and 80% of baby boomers say it's completely unacceptable. But fewer than half of millennials, only 43%, say it's completely unacceptable. So I think that those who are more willing to see a snake on the plane would be millennials.
So there's a split there that the old and the young say, "What are you doing here?" And in the middle we say, "Yeah, if you need this, then go for it."
Yeah, pretty much.
I also see that snakes just barely beat out peacocks as emotional support animals that you would not want to see on a plane. I have to say, the only reason that snakes score higher and only marginally higher, probably within the margin of error, is that most people have not actually heard a peacock screech.
That's probably a very valid point. I think that there's a lot less exposure and fear of those. But we only did ones that there have been major news headlines about. So somebody did try at one point to bring a peacock on a plane.
I'm glad I was not on that one. Food. Since they're not serving us food, we bring our own, and that leads to all sorts of things that people might not have thought of. How do we feel about foods that have a particular aroma?
Yeah, most Americans do not think it is acceptable to bring a pungent food on the plane with you. And we didn't define specifically what pungent was, but the idea there is anything that has an odor, something that you'd be able to tell from a couple seats away. And 69% of Americans said that was somewhat or completely unacceptable to do, which is much higher than the people who say it's unacceptable to recline your seat.
Huh. Okay. Something else to keep in mind. And also shoes. Speaking of aromas, I was a little surprised at this. What are our attitudes toward our neighbors taking off their shoes? Since almost all of us have taken off our shoes at one point, at least in the airport, if not on board.
Right. So I guess Americans just don't want to smell anything on their flight. So 69% say no pungent food, and then 54% say it's unacceptable to take your shoes off mid-flight.
So overall, looking at these numbers, is there anything that surprised you? Is there anything that will cause you to change your behavior next time you're on an airplane?
Oh, goodness. Well, I have never been a person to recline my seat to take off shoes or to bring food on the airplane. But I guess maybe now I have a little bit more courage to go ahead and recline.
Okay. Lindley, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much.
Lindley Sanders is a data journalist at YouGov. By the way, this is a sound a peacock makes, just in case you're wondering if this is a creature you'd like to be sharing a metal tube with 7 miles above the earth. And that's the show. Get Out of Here is a production of the Associated Press in partnership with Westwood One, produced under the supervision of Nikessa Moody and Peter Costanzo. I'm Warren Levinson. We'll see you next time.